Welcome to God with George Ortega and Joshua Bond. This is episode number 34. We're recording it on Tuesday, November 8th, 2020 at 1:29 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're going to start off with creating a consensus between Josh and I on what the accurate nature of God is, what the fundamental nature of God is, something that we can agree upon, understand on an objective level, and then by that to be able to then prepare ourselves to integrate this knowledge, so we're not just knowing God, God becomes more of a complete experience. So Josh, start us off.
Sure, George. Maybe I'll make the consensus a little difficult. For me, I'm coming into this realization, this awareness, and I hang around a lot of younger people and read younger scholars and philosophers to try to get a sense of what the next generation is understanding that I didn't get. And one thing I'm leaning toward is this appreciation for consciousness, individuality, that I don't think is being taught, right? I see it starting to rise to the
All right, but wait a
surface.
minute, that's distinct from God.
Well, so my perspective is to value people. Previous religions valued God over people is what I would summarize it as. And I think that's not what God wanted. That's not why God created people. And that's not why God created the consciousness for us to be able to understand God. And so this new version of God is effectively appreciating our ability to understand God. And so I think that's what we'll get into here, is this consensus of appreciating that ability, or appreciating, through that consensus.
All right. Yeah, in a certain sense, historically, God was to be, pleased to be, but you have to understand, and like the way they thought was that to please God was for our best benefit. In other words, like they truly believed, especially the Christians, that after we die, we go to either a heaven or a hell. So it was like perfect reason that, like, we're only here 100, 120 years, and like to spend this time ensuring that we'll get into heaven, by pleasing God.
Yeah, and so that seems to let me back up a little bit and try to do a better job of addressing the intention you started out with. And I think that is the consensus that God is everything, and for you and I in particular, that means God is all of causality, and understanding causality is very synonymous with understanding God. And I think that's one of the most powerful messages we're bringing to the world with this show, right? Now back to the heaven issue. Similarly, you have the hell issue, and religion has always addressed the unknown, tried to solve problems and quell anxieties about the unknown, and much of that's mostly what happens when we die. Equally is a story of creation, of how we got here, but more people are concerned about death. And so this heaven hell dichotomy that ended up being created largely in the West, I think largely became much more of a
All right.
control. Go ahead.
Basically, yeah, we veered off. We're not talking about religion per se. Let's cut to the chase. What is our difference? You understand my conception of God, right? We've talked about it a lot. Yours is not completely the same. Where do we differ?
I differ at this point, where I would look at it historically, and I don't think I differ. We just hadn't really discussed it. I think you'd agree, largely. So at what point, imagine you could imagine history was in flux, and what version of history would you say, okay, too much atrocity, too much horror, too much manipulation has been caused in the name of God, we should abandon this God concept. Now we have science, we have psychology, we have government to replace this God thing, and we should do that. So like at what point, you could describe some atrocities or something, right? I mean, it's been pretty atrocious and it's been pretty detrimental for a lot of people.
All right, but I mean, like there's a difference between, what our conception of God and religion has done, both for the good and for the bad, and what our general conception of God is. My understanding is that you're not, you're somewhat agnostic on the existence of God. I mean, like, you understand that God is causality, but God is so much more than causality. God is everything. God is the only consciousness there is in the entire universe. So what I want to know is, like, what within that, do you not, let's say, completely agree with? Again, not in terms of, like, the effect of our belief in God has been on humanity, but on who God actually is.
Yeah, again, I think one way to look at it um, is even the view of agnosticism, or even the classification of agnosticism, and God, this idea of God that brings us to these classifications like this. It's very materialistic, and I appreciate the naturalist and materialist view. Um, I don't, a lot of religious people tend to say we're too materialist and all that, and in our science and all that. And I don't do that. But, this, think of it very similar to how most religions in the West view God as an old white man with a beard sitting up in the cloud, judging everything we do, right? And that's very similar to this view of God. It's not similar, but it's the same problem. And the problem is, what if we had this idea that's correct of God as everything, but somewhere down the line, we justified murder and
All right, but
wars and
again, like,
everything?
so, we need to understand clearly where we differ. If we differ, I mean, maybe we don't. So with, yes, we both agree that this, guy with a long beard sitting on a throne in heaven is not, an accurate, proper depiction of God. But what, if I describe God as everything, as the creator of the universe, as eternal, as omnipotent, as like, whatever God says goes, as omniscient, as knowing everything, as being the only being in the universe, what, if any of that, do you believe may not be correct?
I don't really have a problem with that. I don't think. I don't think I would disagree with that idea of God. Now, I think what we're doing here is we're trying to save our ability as a species to salvage an understanding of God. And for me, that has to be a conceptual one, right? And we're the only ones that seem to be doing this. Maybe there's some more that we don't know about, but, you know, uh, imagine a future 20 years where we fail and nobody else is doing it. And the old conceptions of God that are causing problems are all that exists. Could we turn back the clock and you know, how would we do it differently? Or at what point would it be, we should have dedicated a series to talking about some other form of spirituality or something. I don't know.
All right, so we do seem to agree on God as we've been defining God through this series. Your concern is that the world has problems, and well, relative to that, I've mentioned this before. One reason we're doing this series is because the mundane, the human-oriented kinds of solutions, trying to convince people of this, the non-direct approach has not been working very well. Like, in other words, like with religion, it teaches us to, do what we can. God helps those who help themselves, but religion also teaches us to rely on God when all else fails, when we need more help. So this is what our strategy is. This is like, the idea is like, perhaps we're not getting God's sufficient help, or we can get more help by focusing on God, by trying to understand God much more clearly.
Yeah, something just came to mind, and you know, it's interesting dynamic we got going here. I didn't think about this, and hopefully I'm not misspeaking. Don't I'm not too set in stone about this, but often you try to bring me back to talking about God when I've been rambled on to something else. But if our definition is God as everything and God is all causality, really I'm fulfilling that definition by speaking about other things. Now I think what you're sensing is lacking is connecting it for the audience, essentially using the word God often enough in a paragraph about whatever it is, or even in a sentence, right? Um, and so I think that's where it's tricky. That's where it's sticky, is because, religions and ideas of God did used to include all of reality for everybody. It talks about how to be well, and sickness and well-being and famine and
All right.
happy, right?
Yeah, yes, God is everything. So like, you talk about anything, you're talking about God, but like the problem we have in this world is like we can talk about, for example, biology, chemistry, physics in a way that doesn't involve God at all. And it's not that it isn't useful, it's just that it's a different kind of knowledge. Like even in the Bible, they have a lot of stories of people doing a lot of things. God sometimes is actually a minor character in these things. The purpose, what we're experimenting with, what we're hopefully pioneering, is this return of religion. And I don't, maybe it's not a return, maybe it's just like an evolution, move forward, whereas like instead of religions focusing on humans like we tend to do, and again, I'm not sure that's enough, we're focusing more completely on God. And so yes, like it's not just for the audience sake, it's for our sake also. In other words, like, if we want to help the world, we through this way, we have to understand it as well as we can.
Yeah, that's very good what you said there. Yeah, and I think that's still the struggle. Is I think we're teasing out, there's so much value in spirituality, certainly, and even religions, even the religions I really don't like. I recognize they're adding value to people's lives, helping people be better people, and come up with solutions that maybe science and biology hasn't figured out yet, right? And a lot of this is happening in the unconscious or through mystical God mechanisms, right? Through more of a contemplative lifestyle. I think that's what we're doing. We're going through growing pains, and what you and I are doing is kind of verbalizing those, growing pains, or maybe there's a better word for it, but that people aren't doing.
All right, so we understand and agree that, like, what we're doing for a specific purpose, to understand better, um, God better. And so now let's do that more. So like God, and let's actually go to a challenge that's difficult with people. God, the way we understand God, God is not just good, God is evil. And I'm not sure I mean, the audience, I think, can benefit greatly from this, understanding. But even we, I think we need to perhaps better understand how that can be. In other words, like if you were God, why in the world would you create pain and evil? It doesn't make sense, but again, this is what this series is about, better understanding the mind of God.
Yeah, and this may be again, uh, uh, in that question, it describes the sentience to God that I don't know that I would say is not useful in my life. Well, I won't say completely not useful, some degree at some situations, right? And so why would God do that? And I think that's where my understanding of God is more of a God consciousness, and more of a technology, just very similar to how we speak about intuition, right? And gut feelings, right? We don't have a scientific explanation for that. Science is starting to understand, oh, the gut is a second brain. There's a lot of neurotransmitters down there and different things, and that intuition that we talk about usually is very synonymous with that gut feeling, right? And should we throw all of that out the window just because we have a different understanding, just like we talk about the heart, speaking from the heart, right? But we know that that's not accurate
All
like it
right, so
used to be.
your understanding is that God isn't really like a mind, or God doesn't have the kind of mind we do, that, God is just like consciousness. Like God, but I mean, like, how do you explain, if God created, this world, God created knowledge, God created intelligence, God is basically willing us to do everything we do through the causality. God must have known, exactly what we'd be doing and how, and we couldn't naturally do it other than through God with everything we do. So just explain why you prefer to see God more as a thing than as a being, and not just a being, but a being so much superior than anything we can imagine.
Um, yeah, I mean, part of it might be how we think of the mind is I don't necessarily agree with. Maybe there's a similar problem I have with a lot of New Age and even what gets called New Age a lot, that the world has a mind, the Gaia's sentient mind, the Earth, right? And I agree with that. That the Earth is a system, a biological system, and whether it's climate change or any other environmental issue, it's such a complex system, that rivals the complexity of our own mind. And so it is accurate to think about it as a mind. Now, with God not being sent, just because I don't ascribe one type of sentience, maybe one type of consciousness to God that might traditionally be used for an old man in the clouds, doesn't mean I'm not on board with it being a sentient system,
All right,
maybe.
so yeah, so you acknowledge, like I do, that if God is everywhere and everything, God has to be governing everything and from everywhere, which is essentially a local kind of like an explanation of what Gaia theory is. Gaia theory is that the Earth, the planet, is a self-organizing mechanism. Naturally, if God is part of every part of the Earth, then we could see that how God would be guiding through the laws of nature, through God's will, everything that the Earth does. So I'm curious, though, to learn more about the distinction between that kind of consciousness, agency, intelligence, and a different way that you're apparently preferring to see God as, that's somewhat different relative to the sentience.
Well, again, like you use the term God is governing everything. So is God controlling everything? And I would agree with that as well. But it's tricky. It depends on maybe what type of person you are, what your history is, as to how you interpret the semantics of govern, right? Is it an active force that can change its mind? And I don't think so. I think just like we would say the laws of nature govern nature, right, and determine nature, I would say that's the most accurate understanding of God we can all agree on and start with, probably, right? Um, it was, yeah. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that basically, you're right in pointing out that God is constrained by God's nature. For example, if God is eternal, God cannot but be eternal. If God knew, a billion years ago that something would happen today or a billion years from today, God is powerless to change that, because God would be rendering God's knowledge previously to be inaccurate. So yes, God is constrained by God's nature. Now, to the matter of governorship, yes, I think you have to see it in the right way. Like, we have governors of of institutions, political governors, governors of states, and they don't have the difference between that sense of governor and God as a governor is that God's power is absolute. God, if God wants us to do anything God wants us to do, we have to do it. We're completely compelled. It's not up to us in any way.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say that even this gets into the illusion of free will and consciousness as well, being illusory. That we feel like because we're a fellow monkey, a fellow human being, we feel like that politician, that governor, has more agency, more freedom of choice than they really do. If we really studied each choice they make, we could break it down from a psychological perspective. We could see why they view the world that way and why that's forcing them to make the choice. And that would have to take a complete restructuring of their brain to be able to make some other choice oftentimes, right? And so I think that's part of it. That's part of this whole perspective is, our minds are almost like programs in a computer, right? That has an ability to process information, understand things, understand God, but doesn't have a self-reflection of metacognitive ability, or we haven't cultivated enough to realize that we're a program inside a computer, and that's where our God consciousness comes from.
Right. So back to the governorship. Yes, like the human governor doesn't have any choice in what they do, and neither do the governed. That's the key thing. It's like, governorship for a sovereign God is complete. It's a complete kind of a power. You mentioned, this idea, just like a brief clarification. You probably understand this and all, but for the sake of the audience, that it's not like we descended from apes, monkeys. We descended from ape-like creatures. In other words, like the chimpanzee, the different monkeys that exist today, they have a different um, lineage. Now, I imagine we have a similar ancestor going back, before that. I'm wondering if that could be referred to as an ape or a monkey or a chimpanzee. Um, but back to the issue of governorship. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, good. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's important. Again, right there, even with talking about evolutionary theory. So most of the scientists, I believe, still agree on we have a common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos. That common ancestor wasn't like us exactly, and it's not even close, obviously, and also wasn't a chimpanzee and wasn't a bonobos, but the three branches, you know, but there's all sorts of other theories as well, and that we even came out of the sea, the ocean, right? Um, so, you know, and yeah, I don't know. I was gonna go on that tangent, but maybe you can have some ideas
Well, let's, like,
better.
again, we're doing what we do all the time. Like, we could be thinking about God 24 hours a day, you know, and we might want to ask ourselves why we don't. Certainly when we're around people, we're constrained by that. We have to address, actually, in that case, we're addressing God indirectly through other people, and they're addressing God indirectly through us. But the question becomes, like, if to people who acknowledge that God is the ruler of the universe, omnipotent, all knowing and benevolent in a lot of ways. It's an open question. It's perhaps it's not so much a question about God, but a question about us. Why don't we, address God, have God in our consciousness more of the time?
Yeah, I think it's because of our view of God is different, and I imagine if you were a Hindu, for example, their view of God and spirituality seems to be much more encompassing to all of life, right? And that's probably why they're polytheistic, more polytheistic, and have different gods for, all the different aspects. Um, I think that's part of where the work we're doing here is to try to come up with this concept, this idea, this practice of, uh, seeing the spirituality in everything, but different than what I grew up with of there's a spirituality in everything because there's evil forces everywhere trying to tempt you into, and there's and denying the science, that, denying the psychology or the value of therapy or medicine or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the Hindu um, polytheism is really, a theological equivalent to our scientific laws of nature. In other words, like, Hindus have gods for countless, kinds of, they have gods that have a subdomain over many aspects of reality, I imagine. I haven't really studied those gods in any great detail, but they seem very similar to, the chemical laws we understand, the biological laws, the physical laws, what makes, matter and energy and us move. So like, now I think, and yes, even like if you take it to psychology, what had people do things there because of the gods, we do because of what we understand of our unconscious, and that's science.
Yeah. And again, even using psychology, right? I think they kind of have the same problem as religion traditionally. Like I say a lot, there's basically, you could say there's 400 schools of psychology and they don't agree and they often fight, but they never really try to solve the issue of why are we fighting or why do we disagree, from a metacognitive perspective that's effective. And I think the similar to how religions fail to do that, and what that's left people in a bad spot, because now we have being stuck between science and religion, and so often religion is wrong, so often science is wrong or misleading or even exploitive in some regards. All right, and we don't have, traditionally, I think that's one of the main values of this God consciousness, is for humans to be able to function at a higher level despite these flaws in the systems.
Yeah, I think, aside from certain kind of like facts, like the age of the earth, whether the earth is flat or round, there's science and religion, the scientific understanding of God and the religious understanding of God really are not in competition. Basically, the idea is that science acknowledges that it doesn't really comment or make assertions about what it cannot perceive. And so much about what God theologically is has to do with what science can't perceive. So, they're kind of like similar, there's similar kinds of approaches that are complementary rather than contradictory. All right, that's all we have time for today. And so like, we'll see you here tomorrow. Yeah.